Chapter 2, Holistic Healing, Trauma Awareness, and Human Flourishing. Abstract. This chapter advances holistic healing as a core ethical requirement for leadership, governance, and public responsibility in contexts shaped by trauma, chronic stress, and structural harm. Moving beyond therapeutic or individualistic models, holistic healing is framed as the restoration of regulated relational capacity, ethical clarity, and lawful participation, integrating trauma-informed neuroscience, moral psychology, leadership ethics, and public interest law. The chapter demonstrates how unintegrated trauma distorts consent, power, and judgment, thereby increasing the risk of coercive leadership and systemic violence. Holistic healing is thus positioned as a civic obligation and a foundational condition for sustainable human flourishing. Keywords: holistic healing, trauma-informed leadership, ethical agency, consent, nervous system regulation, violence prevention, human flourishing. 2.1 Reframing healing as civic and ethical responsibility. In much contemporary discourse, healing is treated as a private or therapeutic pursuit oriented toward personal well-being. While such approaches are valuable, they are insufficient for addressing the ethical consequences of trauma within leadership, organizational, and governance contexts. This chapter reframes healing as a civic and ethical responsibility with direct implications for power, consent, and public trust. Holistic healing is defined as the process through which individuals restore psychological regulation, somatic safety, ethical coherence, and lawful relational capacity following experiences of trauma or prolonged stress. This definition deliberately situates healing within relational and institutional domains, rather than confining it to intrapsychic or clinical settings. Leaders who have not engaged in meaningful healing frequently carry unresolved threat responses into positions of authority, where these responses distort judgment and compromise ethical decision-making. From this perspective, healing is neither optional nor self-indulgent. It is a prerequisite for exercising power without coercion and for participating responsibly in democratic and organizational life. 2.2 Trauma as adaptation and source of ethical distortion. Trauma is conceptualized in this framework not as pathology, but as an adaptive response to overwhelming threat. Research in effective neuroscience and trauma studies demonstrates that trauma reorganizes perception, attention, and time orientation in ways that support survival, but undermine ethical reasoning when left unintegrated. Hypervigilance, numbing, and dominance-oriented behaviors are common adaptive patterns that become ethically hazardous in leadership roles. Unintegrated trauma distorts ethical perception by narrowing attentional bandwidth, accelerating decision timelines, and increasing threat sensitivity. Leaders operating under these conditions are more likely to override consent, misinterpret dissent as danger, and justify coercive actions as necessary or protective. These dynamics contribute to emotional manipulation, economic coercion, and other forms of structural violence that are often normalized within institutions. Holistic healing addresses these distortions by restoring regulatory flexibility and reflective capacity, enabling leaders to respond rather than react. 2.3 Nervous system regulation and relational safety. Nervous system regulation constitutes a central mechanism of holistic healing. Findings from effective neuroscience and polyvagal theory indicate that physiological state profoundly shapes moral reasoning, empathy, and relational behavior. Regulated nervous systems support curiosity, perspective taking, and delayed response, whereas dysregulated systems prioritize control, avoidance, or dominance. Relational safety emerges when leaders can remain regulated in the presence of disagreement, uncertainty, or emotional intensity. This capacity enables genuine consent and reduces the likelihood of coercive influence. Regulation is not synonymous with calmness. Rather, it reflects the ability to remain responsive and ethically available under stress. By foregrounding regulation, holistic healing provides a concrete, non-moralistic mechanism through which ethical leadership becomes possible. 2.4 Distinguishing holistic healing from clinical treatment. It is essential to distinguish holistic healing, as articulated here, from clinical or therapeutic treatment. While psychotherapy, psychiatry, and medical interventions play indispensable roles in trauma recovery, leadership and governance are not sites of clinical care. Holistic healing acknowledges the ethical implications of trauma without medicalizing leadership or transferring therapeutic roles to institutions. The focus remains on functional ethical capacity, the ability to uphold consent, respect boundaries, and operate within legal and moral norms. This distinction safeguards role clarity and prevents paternalistic misuse of trauma-informed language. 2.5 Consent as embodied and ethical process. Unintegrated trauma significantly compromises the integrity of consent, particularly in contexts of asymmetrical power. Individuals may comply outwardly while internally dissociating, submitting under pressure, or fearing retaliation. Such false consent violates dignity and undermines ethical legitimacy, even in the absence of overt coercion. Holistic healing reframes consent as a dynamic, embodied, and trauma-sensitive process, rather than a static legal or procedural formality. Leaders who engage in healing are better equipped to recognize subtle signals of withdrawal, coercion, or distress, and to adjust power dynamics accordingly. This understanding of consent has far-reaching implications for leadership ethics, workplace governance, education, and emerging technological systems. 2.6 Trauma-based distortions and leadership risk, a typology. To clarify the ethical risks associated with unintegrated trauma, this chapter introduces a typology of trauma-based distortions relevant to leadership contexts: dominant threat response, ethical risk, leadership manifestation, hypervigilance, consent override, micromanagement, numbing, withdrawal, moral disengagement, neglect, dominance control, structural coercion, authoritarianism. This typology illustrates how adaptive survival responses, when carried into leadership roles without healing, translate into predictable patterns of harm. 2.7 Holistic healing, law, and public accountability. Holistic healing must remain compatible with legal standards that protect rights, ensure due process, and prevent abuse. Trauma awareness does not justify boundary violations, exceptionalism, or the suspension of accountability. On the contrary, healing strengthens adherence to law by increasing the leader's capacity for restraint, responsibility, and transparency. Legal frameworks governing violence prevention, workplace safety, and human rights provide external containment that complements internal regulation. When leaders align healing with lawful accountability, they contribute to institutional legitimacy and public trust. 2.8 Human flourishing and collective healing. Human flourishing is presented as the ethical outcome of holistic healing. Flourishing is defined not by productivity or subjective well-being alone, but by sustained dignity, autonomy, relational safety, and lawful participation in social life. These criteria align with moral philosophy, public ethics, and international human rights standards. Holistic healing is further understood as a collective process supported by communities, institutions, and cultural practices. Rituals, shared norms, and safe relational spaces play critical roles in sustaining regulation and ethical capacity beyond individual effort. This collective dimension is essential for addressing historical and cultural trauma. 2.9 Conclusion: Healing as foundation for ethical presence. This chapter has established holistic healing as a central pillar of quiet excellence and ethical leadership. By integrating trauma-informed neuroscience, embodied consent, lawful accountability, and collective responsibility, holistic healing emerges as a civic obligation essential to violence prevention and human flourishing. The following chapter examines presence as the operational mechanism through which healing and regulation are enacted in real-world leadership and governance contexts.